I'm Heath Lambert, and you're listening to a bonus episode of What Happened at First Baptist Church. This bonus episode is for ministry staff, pastors, leaders, and anyone else wanting to take a deeper look at the revitalization of First Baptist Church to learn something about the mistakes and the successes we made during the changes at our church. In 2018, I was sitting at First Baptist Church as the sole senior pastor, and our facilities were broken down. They were outrageously expensive to maintain. Those facilities were massive beyond anything that we needed, and they were far more expensive to fix than anything approaching what we could afford. Something had to be done to fix it. I did the only thing I knew to do. I assembled the best minds available from our staff, from our congregation, and from firms actually all across the country, church consultants and real estate consultants and construction experts and urban planners. There was a lot of people at the table. And we talked through all sorts of options. We talked about relocating to another campus that we owned in another spot in the city. We talked about relocating to another part of the city that we would buy. We talked about various combinations of blocks that we would use. We talked about new construction. We talked about all sorts of things. But when all was said and done, we settled on a plan that took our 12 unaffordable, impossible to maintain blocks and reduced them to one block that would be completely renovated with new top-notch facilities that'd be easily accessible to our members, to our families, and to our visitors. And most of the other 12 blocks would be sold with the proceeds going to the construction effort and future ministry projects. It wasn't a perfect plan. Nobody believed that, but everyone agreed, actually unanimously, that it was the best plan that we could develop, and everybody agreed to move forward. I pitched this plan to our lay leadership, who backed the plan unanimously, and then I took the plan to the church, who overwhelmed me with an enthusiastic demonstration of support. By the time we got to the approval of that plan, it was late 2019. We began to move forward on the plan, and then disaster struck. The COVID pandemic hit the world a matter of weeks after our property hit the market. Our plan, I need to tell you, to fund all of this renovation and all of this construction was completely based on the capital that would be generated by the sale of property. And the commercial real estate market was now in a COVID-induced freefall. In a matter of weeks, we went from dozens of interested buyers to zero interested buyers. And the plan had completely stalled. I tell you that story because I want you to know as a leader that when you are leading through change, things will fail. Things will not go according to plan. You can thank God it won't always be a global pandemic that disrupts your plans, but it will be something. Givers are going to decide not to contribute. Construction will take longer than you planned. People you thought were with you will betray you. With all of this movement, your weaknesses are going to show, and you are going to come up short as a leader. That certainly happened to me during the revitalization of the First Baptist Church. I'm telling you this story about how the plan failed and had to change because that's something that went wrong. That's going to happen. But I don't want to talk to you just about things that go wrong for which you're not responsible. I'm not responsible for a global pandemic. I'm not responsible for the commercial real estate market in downtown Jacksonville. I am responsible for myself, and you are responsible for yourself. Whether you are leading change or participating in it, I want to help you understand the weaknesses of a leader and the weaknesses of your leader by talking about the weaknesses I'm most familiar with, and those are my own. There are two reasons why it is important for me to talk to you about my own mistakes and my own failings. The first reason has to do with last week's emphasis on lies. We spent a lot of time last week talking about the fact that people are going to lie about you in ministry. I used as an example lies that were told about me in ministry, and those lies were harmful. But I don't ever want to indicate that simply because there were bad things said about me that weren't true, that there were not bad things about me that were true. In fact, one of the things that I talked about all the time around here during the years of transition is there are plenty of bad things about me that are true. It's just that those bad things aren't the things that are being shared. And so I want to tell you some of the bad things about me, some of the bad things that were true of me that I really did do. I want to talk to you candidly about that. That's the first reason why it's important to talk about that. The second reason it's important to talk about this is because of the overall narrative of this podcast. As I talk about the incredible changes that took place and the fact that after a hard number of years, we are now in a good spot, you might think that because I'm telling this story, that I believe I am the hero of this story, or that I want you to believe that I am the hero of this story. Well, that is not true. You need to hear me say, I am not the hero of this story. I do not believe I am the hero of this story, and I don't want you to believe I am the hero of this story. We are Christians. This is the ministry of the Lord Jesus Christ. There is room for only one hero, and his name is Jesus. I believe that to be true with all of my heart, and I want to prove that it is true by talking about how faithful Jesus was in spite of me. I want to prove to you that Jesus was strong by telling you how weak I am. The fact of the matter is, as Jesus used me, he exposed a lot of weakness and he revealed a lot of failure. And I want you to hear about those from me. We don't have time on this podcast or on any podcast to talk about all of my weaknesses. But what I'd like to do is share with you just 12 mistakes that I made as a leader at First Baptist, some of the things I learned about myself and about leadership and about ministry and those mistakes, and I hope those mistakes and those lessons will be a help to you. The first mistake I made is that I often prioritized planning over prayer. During the years of transition at First Baptist, problems were coming at me like snow in a blizzard. It was constantly one thing after the other. It was constantly one thing after the other. It was not uncommon for me to be in a meeting solving one problem when someone would walk in with a different problem that needed an immediate solution before they could leave. And in those busy, active moments, my temptation, which the people who worked for me can talk about, was to pick up a dry erase marker and go to the whiteboard and start hammering out a solution. I don't mean to say that I never prayed. In fact, I would say that I don't believe there was any major problem that we faced at First Baptist that I did not pray for and pray for sincerely and plead with the Lord about. What I'm trying to communicate is that my instinct was not to pray first. It was something that I often thought of later. And this was bad. This was really not good. It reveals an instinct of independence in my heart where I should be more reliant on the Lord. It added a lot of anxiety to my heart. One of the functions of prayer is to remind ourselves that the Lord loves us, that he's got this, and I missed that opportunity. It added a frenetic sense of chaos to my team who were always go, 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 go. And now I'm pulling the cap off this dry erase marker and trying to solve this problem when it would have been a help to say, guys, let's pray. It was a really bad example of a spiritual leader to set in front of other spiritual leaders. It was bad, and it hurt. It hurt me, it hurt my team, it hurt the effort, and God did so much in those years to teach me the beauty of prayer and pausing to depend on Him in our transition. In Philippians chapter 4, verse 6, the Bible says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God." I don't think there's a passage of Scripture in the Bible that I more regularly violated than Philippians 4:6. And it was a tremendous mistake that I regret. Next, I communicated in good faith with people who were communicating in bad faith. This just might have been the most damaging in terms of the outward effort. In a staff working toward transition, you figure out pretty quickly how to spot the people who are opposing the change. And we had several. We had several people who were just digging in their heels, who didn't want to change, who didn't want to transition. I've talked about this before. They weren't concerned about whether the church was succeeding or failing as long as they had their thing. And these folks were trying to undermine change. They will try to undermine change and growth at your place of ministry. They will try to undermine you. And I was always trying to persuade these people. I would meet with them alone, thinking that if they could just see my heart, if they could just understand my arguments, if they could just see my sincerity, they'll be persuaded and they'll get on board. And it never worked. And it actually caused a lot of trouble. It caused a lot of wasted time. It actually created a lot of pain as those people misrepresented conversations that we had one-on-one, and there was no witnesses to corroborate one side or the other. Listen, it's one thing to have a charitable willingness to meet. It's another thing to foolishly fail to see when others are using your charity to undermine you and the change efforts that you're seeking to initiate. And I was foolishly failing to see what was obvious. I learned to address this mistake, which is just a perennial weakness in my own heart. I learned to address this mistake by giving other leaders around me the right to tell me when I should no longer meet alone with people who were causing trouble and who were going to not communicate in good faith, even as I was trying to help. I over-communicated. One of the things most people in our church know about me is that I desire transparency. I think this is one of the most significant realities I have a reputation for at our church. I wanted to be an open book and always seek to communicate with as much candor as I could. I still try to do that today. And just at the outset, I want to say I think this is, generally speaking, a strength. I think it is generally good when you are in leadership at a ministry, generally to be transparent and to have an instinct towards candor. But a desire to be candid always has to give way to what is wise to communicate in the moment. You really can get too much of a good thing, even if that good thing is candor and transparency. There were times when I shared too much information with our congregation about plans that were not fully complete. On one occasion, I shared what I wanted to do with a piece of property that we were keeping, but we needed to repurpose. We weren't actively using it at that moment, but we weren't going to sell it, and so we needed to repurpose it. And I was getting questions about it, and so I just told everybody what I wanted to do with it and what I hoped would happen, just in front of the room at a Q&A. Everybody heard it, and some people loved the idea and asked countless questions about when it would be done and how much it would cost and what we were going to do on it. And then a lot of other people hated the idea and complained about spending the money on it and the loads of time that we were going to spend on it. And they shared all their ideas about how we could do something way better with the space. And it just took up all kinds of time. It took up all kinds of energy. It backed us into corners to have no answers to questions that people were asking. And the reality was, it was a lack of discipline on my part. And that lack of discipline created a lot of unnecessary frustration in our congregation, and it created countless wasted hours and wasted energy for me and my team as we tried to explain this thing that I talked about before it was ready. I learned, and am learning, not to make announcements about large plans until we've done our due diligence, until I've gotten key leaders on board, and until I'm ready to make a persuasive case about why we need to do it. I under-communicated. On the other end of the continuum from over-communicating is under-communicating, and I did that plenty too. Even though I generally operate by the creed of giving as much information to as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, there were times when I fell short of that. A lot of examples about this, but many of these times had to do with dishonest accusations made about me, made about people in our congregation, made about our church in general, that were spread by dishonest people in our church and online. I've talked about this in previous episode, but there was a season in our church when rumors and lies felt like they were swirling through our congregation like gnats in a summer picnic. While that was going on, I was really disoriented about what to say. My instinct was silence because I didn't want to defend myself. I didn't want to say bad things about people, particularly ministers, because I didn't want to undermine their ministries after they had moved on to other places. There were all sorts of reasons why my instinct was silence, but the reality was that damage came from that silence in folks believing ridiculous lies about good people. As I record this to you, I just spoke yesterday, years after this all happened. I just spoke yesterday to a man who is still broken and sad about relationships he had had for decades that are now over because of this dishonesty and these lies. And I've come to believe that I had more of a responsibility to protect the truth, not to defend myself, but to protect the truth than I took at the time. You don't want to respond to everything. You can't respond to everything. But if I could do it over again, I would create some way to fact check and correct some of the lies. One of the things that I did talk about on a previous episode was creating a place on our website to respond to frequent rumors, lies, misrepresentations. And I think that could have been communication that would help. But as it was, my instinct was to say, I think too little, and that caused too much pain, and I under-communicated. I miscommunicated. So I over-communicated, I under-communicated, and I miscommunicated. There were times when I said the wrong thing. As a forgetful guy, which I am, one of the hardest parts about my job are all the things I need to remember before I stand up to speak. By the time information comes to me, getting it wrong could mean hundreds and thousands of people are led in the wrong direction. I'll tell you a funny example of when this happened. One of the things that I instituted at First Baptist were these Life Together fellowships. We'd have a Life Together town hall where I'd give updates to everybody, I'd take people's questions, and then we'd go fellowship together. And sometimes these things will happen at Christmas, and we'll roast marshmallows and have wagon rides with horses. And sometimes these things will happen in the fall, and we'll drink apple cider. And we do them at various times throughout the year. And it's just a great time for all of our folks to be together, and there's nothing to do except be together. We always, at these Life Together fellowships, have games for kids because we have hundreds of kids in our congregation and we want them to have fun while their parents are hanging out. And one night, as we were dismissing from our Life Together town hall and heading over to the fellowship, I was making the announcement about what was going to be taking place across the street, and I got off the script that was handed to me. Staff worked out a very careful list of what I needed to say and how I needed to say it, and they handed it to me, and I got off script. I put it down and I started talking about the event without the benefit of the notes, and I started not thinking about the script that was handed to me, and I started thinking about a different meeting that I was in, about a different Life Together fellowship that was coming, and I announced the activities that were going to be taking place at that future event. I talked about games and rock climbing walls, and the problem was there was no rock climbing wall at the event across the street. And by the time I got across the street, I discovered hundreds of families roaming around wondering where the rock climbing wall was. And I had to essentially take candy from a baby and tell them that this thing that they so wanted to do isn't going to happen at First Baptist Church tonight. I've learned a lot of lessons about miscommunicating. I'm learning to make fewer announcements and to delegate the work of announcing things to people who can focus on it while I've got other things to do on Sunday. And when it's me who's making these announcements, I really try to get all the details and to stick with the written details instead of going off book. Before I leave this point, I just want to point out, and I want you to notice all the mistakes that I've made about communication. I communicated in good faith when people were communicating in bad faith. I over-communicated, I under-communicated, I miscommunicated. One of the most important jobs any leader has, especially a leader in a transition at a church, is communication. And the best communicators are going to make communication mistakes. You will make communication mistakes. I have made more than my fair share of communication mistakes. And when that happens, you need to admit it, you need to ask Jesus for help, and you need to ask the people around you for help as well. I showed fear. I showed fear. Transitions are scary. You've got a situation where things can't keep going or you're going to die. The church won't make it. But you're proposing solutions and plans for which there are no guarantees that they're going to work either. And so it really is a rock and a hard place situation. And it is scary. And I wish I could tell you the number of wise, mature, godly people in our congregation who shared with me how afraid they were at various points in the transition, that we didn't know if our church was going to make it. We didn't know if this plan was going to work. We knew we had to do something, but we were scared. At various points in the transition, that happened. These things are scary. And I'm not trying to say it should be anything other than that. But as the leader, you cannot show fear. You probably will struggle with fear. I know that I did. You need to get help with that. You need to grow in your relationship with Jesus in that. You need to turn from sin and trust in Him. You need to get other people to help you with that. But as a leader, you cannot show fear. If everybody else is afraid and then you're afraid and you stop saying, here's where we're going to go and it's going to be good and it's going to be great, and even if it doesn't work, the Lord's going to help us. If you show fear, you're going to cripple everybody else who is afraid as well. And one of the worst mistakes I made was at a crucial moment in our transition, I showed fear. It was a season after our time of layoffs when a lot of people lost their job. We had literally lost over 100 employees, and it was a hard time because even the people who weren't angry were just sad about these departures. Even the people who knew it needed to happen just felt bad that it happened. I was being constantly accused of every single wicked thing you can possibly imagine. I got accused of being everything but the second gunman on the grassy knoll. Our people were watching everything in the church they loved change, and it was just a tumultuous time. And then I got bad news about Dr. John Sullivan. Now, John Sullivan, if you don't know, is an institution in the Florida Baptist Convention, and he is an institution at First Baptist Church. Dr. Sullivan led the Florida Baptist Convention for nearly 30 years before his retirement. And then he had been hired as the pastor of senior adults by my predecessor, Mac Brunson, with an understanding that he would serve for 5 years. In 2020, right as all of this change is taking place, right as we're in the midst of a global pandemic, his 5 years were up, and he and his wife, Nancy, were ready to retire to be near their children and grandchildren. Dr. Sullivan ultimately changed his mind about that desire to retire, and he stayed at First Baptist, and he is still serving as I record this podcast today. He is a valuable member of our staff. He is a beloved member of our congregation, and everybody loves Dr. Sullivan. But that knowledge of him changing his mind would only come later. On one particular afternoon, in fact, the particular afternoon that I heard he was quitting, I was overwhelmed. I was aware of all these rumors floating around. I was aware of all the problems we were facing. I was aware of all the strength and stability that Dr. Sullivan brought to our church. I knew how fragile things were. And I was in a room with staff and leaders when one of our pastors pulled me aside and said that Dr. Sullivan was going to be asking for a meeting with me that day to tell me that he would be leaving in the next few weeks. And as I stood in that room around that table, honestly, things went black. Talking to you, I can remember how it felt. I was overwhelmed, and I remember closing my eyes. I remember putting my hands on my head, and I remember leaning up against a wall and sliding down to the ground. I was petrified, and I'm not sure how long I stayed like that, but my first awareness of anything other than just a soul that was screaming was another person in the room, a different pastor in the room, saying, "Why is the senior pastor on the floor?" I opened my eyes and I saw a room full of people staring at me with shock, with fear, and mirroring my sense of being overwhelmed. Overwhelmed by the circumstances, I showed a lot of fear. And I want to let you know that this was a failure on my part to trust God. God's plan was always to care for me. Remember, I told you that Dr. Sullivan never left. He never even went anywhere. He very quickly decided that he did not want to retire and that he wanted to continue to serve Jesus in our church. Even if his plans had not changed and he had moved away to retire with his children and grandchildren, God still would have helped even in that problem. But I didn't trust the Lord. I trusted in circumstances, and circumstances did what they do, and they let me down, and I was afraid, and I showed that fear to people who needed me to be a better leader than I was. It was a real failure to lead on my part. I was overwhelmed, and I led them to be overwhelmed. I know leaders aren't always perfect. I certainly know I'm not perfect. But we have to be so full of trust in the Lord that the people can follow us with confidence. And I really failed that day in that solemn task. I failed to serve my family. This one is very hard for me to talk about, but so you'll understand what I'm trying to communicate, let me share several pieces of background information. First, if you are not in ministry, then you won't appreciate this. But if you are in ministry, you are an expert in this, that ministry defies a schedule. There's no way to do ministry inside any regular, ordinary, predetermined amount of time. It's not a 9-to-5 job. When a church member dies, you have to go. You have to be with the family, and you have to be there for as long as it takes. You can't look at your watch and tap it and say it's time to go. When there is a crisis at church, you have to lead, and nobody cares or should care that you put your time in that week already. So ministry is hard, and it defies schedules. Family is also hard and defies schedules. When your family needs you, they just need you. They don't care, nor should they care, that it's in the middle of a workday, or you have an unfinished project, or the sermon isn't prepared to the point that you would like it to be. They need you, and that need, by the way, actually isn't always urgent. Sometimes it's a ball game. Your kids need to look up and see their pastor dad standing by the ball field watching them take a swing. It's not just, I got to take you to the emergency room. They need to look out at their piano recital and see their pastor dad standing there, sitting there, cheering for them. Balancing ministry and family is a challenge for every single person in ministry that I know. In my family, this is something that we have tended to do rather well. Honestly, when I got to First Baptist, I had a 15-year track record of mostly success. If you talk to my wife, if you talk to my kids, there was nobody in my family, and is nobody in my family, who will tell you feels like dad is really treating ministry like it's one of his kids. You won't hear my wife say, I feel like my husband is really married to ministry and not me. My family knew there were times when ministry carried me away, but they also knew that I prioritized them, and there were times that I put ministry away to emphasize them. This just has not been a difficulty in our home and in our life, in our family together. But then we moved to Jacksonville, and then I became the senior pastor of a very, very large church facing some really, really big problems. And the schedule challenges were ongoing, and the schedule challenges were overwhelming. There were constant, and I mean, I'm telling you, constant interruptions at dinner. The phone would start to ring, and it was an urgent call, and guys, I got to take this. And I'd get off that phone, and I'd come back, and then the phone would ring again, and it's, guys, I got to take this. And then dinner was over. That happened all the time. It hadn't really happened before. There'd been episodic interruptions, but these were ongoing and constant. There were constant late arrivals coming home. Babe, I'm going to be home late tonight. Hey, kids, go ahead and finish dinner. I'll be home afterwards and we'll talk then. I was really, really good about explaining to my crew what was going on, and actually everybody really understood. I gave them all the time I really could, and it's like I said, I had 15 years of them knowing I'm not trying to throw anybody under the bus, but I'm telling you, it was tough. Another thing that was tough on my family about the transition at First Baptist was not just the schedule challenges, but my family was terribly mistreated. My wife was mistreated by people who call themselves Christians. My children were mistreated by people who called themselves Christians. I could not believe the mistreatment that my children received from Christian leaders, from pastors. I couldn't believe it. In fact, I will tell you that one of the ways that I knew we were dealing with sheer and utter wickedness was that people who paraded themselves as Christians and people who want reputations online as being wise and kind Christians, they were torpedoing my wife and my children. And that was the example to me that this is not just a disagreement. This is not good people on different sides of a coin. This is wickedness and horrible, ungodly behavior. It was terrible that my wife and my kids for years were subjected to the kind of treatment that they were. And then another thing that was hard about the transition at First Baptist was that my family was overwhelmed by how badly I was treated. No matter how bad things got, no matter how terrible were the accusations, no matter how vicious were the lies, my family always encouraged me. My family never doubted me. My family was actually brought closer together. We love each other more now than we did before all of this happened. And I actually learned to love the acceptance and the love and the warmth of my family when it felt like at times everybody else was rejecting me. And it was encouraging and stabilizing to know that the people who knew me the best, to know that the people who saw me at my weakest, to know that the people who saw me at my worst, who know me better than anybody, they were the ones who said, "Dad, we know this isn't true. Dad, we know you're doing the best you can. Honey, you know I love you, and these people are crazy." But it was hard on my family to see their dad go through what I went through. It was hard on my wife to see her husband go through what I was going through. And so this was all just part of the recipe of honestly terror in the transition at First Baptist. And during the transition, I knew I had to see it through. I knew I couldn't leave while under attack. One of my goals throughout this whole thing was I want to leave one day the person who succeeds me, I want to leave him a better situation than I inherited. And so I was committed to seeing it through no matter how hard it got, but I also gave my family a veto. My family knew they had a veto. My wife knew and my kids knew, listen, if you don't want to do this anymore, if you can't do this anymore, then we will leave. They knew that. We talked about it. I asked them about it with regularity. They never used it. They actually never got close to using it. At one point, Lauren and I had a relatively brief conversation when some really attractive job offers came in, but the conversation wasn't about, boy, should we do it? The conversation was about, there's no way to do this. And so my wife and my kids never used the veto that I gave them, even though the difficulties were crushing. They stuck with the church, they stuck with me, they stuck with the transition, and they stuck with it over 4 excruciating years. And I am so thankful for that. But at a time in this podcast when I'm being honest with you about the mistakes I made, I have come to believe that I was wrong in how I handled this situation with my wife and my kids. It was fine that I gave them a veto. It was fine that I gave them an out. It was fine that I gave them a parachute. It's wonderful that they never used that. But I've come to believe that instead of giving them an out, I should have led better. There was a season about midway through all this when everything was bad. Kids had lost friends. Wife had lost friends. The problems were unrelenting. I was starting to experience medical difficulties due in part from the stress that I was under. And I should have said to Lauren and the kids, we're not doing this anymore. I should have said, I am not going to let you be subjected to this. It's going to send the wrong message to leave. It's going to hurt staff and other people who have been with me, but you are my priority. God has made, it's more important that I'm your husband and that I'm your dad than that I'm anybody's pastor or anybody's boss. And I should have said, we're out of here. And I did not do that. And I would have been a better husband and a better dad if I had. It's one of the worst errors I've made in everything that happened at First Baptist. I also want to let you know that God has been incredibly kind to me in this failure. My wife and kids love our church. They love our home. They want to be here. They want to be invested in our churches even as they get older. They don't want to be any place else. And when they hear me talk about this, they say this is not a failure on your part. But I really believe it was. I think what it is not that it isn't a failure on my part. I think it's the kindness of God. I think it's the kindness of God to turn our failures into successes. I think it is God being wise when I am foolish. So I'm very thankful for him, and I am very, very sorry for how I failed my family. But I'm also very, very thankful for what God did in that failure, that my family and I love each other. We love each other more than we did before. We are stronger together than we were before. We are in a church that we love and that loves us. And it is a demonstration, not that I didn't fail. It's a demonstration that for those who love God and are called according to his purposes, all things work for good. It's also proof that when God calls a man to a ministry, he doesn't just call a man, he also calls a family, and he makes a way even when we can't find one. I was a naive leader who failed to understand the dynamics of change. Listen, institutional change happens all the time. I mean, every organization that is alive, every organization that is succeeding, whether that's a church or a business or anything else, has endured change, is enduring change, or will endure change. And because that change is happening all the time in these institutions, there is a large body of literature about it. And I've read some of that literature. I've read some of the best and most popular books out there about leading change and how change works. I know how hard it can be, and I came into First Baptist knowing how hard it can be. Leading people to accept and embrace change is one of the hardest leadership tasks out there. But I thought we could make it different. I thought we could make it easier. I thought if I was clear enough, if I was kind enough, if I was willing enough to meet, if I was willing enough to answer questions, that we could get, probably not everybody, but we could get almost everybody on board. That thinking was naive at best and prideful at worst. The reality is change is hard. And there isn't anybody who can make it unhard. There isn't anybody who can make enemies of change magically be friendly by the power of their personality or the persuasiveness of their arguments. Change is just hard. It has been hard for every other leader. It was hard for me. It's going to be hard for you. Change was opposed at my church. Change is going to be opposed at your church. And the issue here is one of expectations. I just set my expectations too high. We're going to get everybody on board. Everybody's going to see the light on this. Everybody's going to get on the same page. Everybody's going to be great. And it meant, those high expectations did, it meant that I had a pretty far fall when reality set in. Here's what I learned from that mistake. I learned to have the goal of universal acceptance, but not the expectation of universal acceptance. That is to say, I learned to work really, really hard to get everybody on board, to leave no person behind, but then also expect that after I do my best, after I try my hardest, we're just not going to win everybody. I misunderstood the opposition. I faced stiff opposition. I was attacked online, lied about online by people who knew what they were doing, knew they were being dishonest, knew what kind of pain they were inflicting. I received horrible hate mail. I had petitions circulate to get me fired and take away not just my ministry, but the livelihood of my wife and my children. I had people reach out to family members and friends who live in other parts of the country in an effort to dig up dirt on me and try to find something that could discredit me. I was followed by people when I was out in public to see if I would do anything that would give them fodder to hold over my head. That's all bad enough. Here's the worst part. The most significant people who opposed me in these kinds of ways, I'm not talking about disagreement, I'm talking about this wicked, horrible kind of opposition. The most significant people who did it were my friends, were pastors' wives, were people I had shared dinner with, were people who had been in my home and who had invited me in their home, sometimes just days before they did some of these horrible things. And when I saw this behavior back then, and when I still see it today, I couldn't believe it. I really couldn't believe that it was happening. I couldn't believe that someone would do this to people that they said they loved. I couldn't believe that women and pastors who parade a reputation for loving children would lead in an effort to harm my children in a way that they did. I couldn't believe that people who had made investments in a church for years would then seek to destroy the church that they said they loved. I couldn't believe people would do this to their enemies. Listen, the worst case scenario is every bad thing that was said about me was true, and I am an awful, horrible, terrible enemy to people. But if we're Christians, Jesus says you got to love your enemies. And so I didn't even understand the hatred and the vitriol that I saw, even if I was someone's enemy. It was shocking. It was really crushing. It was one of the most disorienting realities that I have ever experienced, and to this day that I still experience. I learned to pay attention to the way opposition works in the Bible. You know, this is amazing. I never read the Bible this way before. When you read the Gospels, when you read Acts, when you read the prophets, every single one of these guys are opposed. It's one of the most clear messages in the Bible. There are good folks who love Jesus in the Bible who left our church because they thought, well, if this guy's the real deal, he wouldn't have this kind of opposition. And you have to look at Jesus. You have to look at the prophets. You have to look at the apostles. Every faithful leader in God's kingdom gets opposed. And the most significant reality about religious opposition in the Bible is that the religious opposition comes from religious people. It is religiously established people who don't like the threat posed by the leader. They don't like the threat posed by the new way of doing things. They love their position. They love their power. They love their prestige. They love all that more than they love other Christians. They love all of that more than they love their church. They love all that more than they love Jesus. And they'll love all that more than they love you. And you will find yourself having an enemy in these kinds of people. It is the case with every single faithful leader in the Bible. And if you are faithful, religious people are going to oppose you. And you need to understand it as I had to come to understand it. Another really important lesson that I learned about this is not just that the opposition will be religious people, but I have really learned to love my enemies. I've learned to be thankful. Jesus tells us we are supposed to love our enemies and to pray for those who persecute us. And I didn't have enemies like this before I came to First Baptist. I'd been in ministry all of my adult life, had great stories to tell, have great friends all over the world, and I am thankful for the opportunity that Jesus has given me to obey a command of His to love my enemies that I'd never really had the opportunity to obey before. It's actually one of the reasons why I'm not outing anybody on this podcast. One of my commitments is I might have enemies, but I'm not going to be an enemy to anybody. They might think I'm their enemy, but I'm not going to treat them like one. I'm going to love them, I'm going to pray for them, and I'm going to do everything I can to help them and not do anything to get in the way of the restoration that I pray for every single day. I did not take breaks. There's a couple reasons why I didn't take breaks during the transition at First Baptist. First of all, honestly, when I got to Jacksonville, I really didn't think I needed them. Ministry energized me. It never tired me out. That doesn't mean that I was obsessed with it and enslaved to it and didn't spend time with my wife and kids. I've already talked about that. These people who say, I need a vacation, I never felt that way. We went on family vacations. That wasn't because I needed them, but I love being with my family, and families like to do fun things. And so I did take breaks, but I never felt like I needed a break before I got to Jacksonville. And then when I got to Jacksonville, I wasn't here for very long, just a few years. Things were pretty tough. I was pretty exhausted. I'm working sometimes 18, sometimes 20-hour days. I'm regularly working 7-day weeks. And I got real tired real quick. And I knew I needed a break, but then I didn't know how to afford a break. There was always so many things happening, just a constant, unending stream of trouble, a constant, unending gush of problems that I didn't know how to afford the breaks. There would be times when we would try to take breaks and some disaster would strike. I can remember that one time we had worked for weeks to arrange an overnight trip that Lauren and I were going to take. And we had this whole big system set up where we had childcare for the kids. We had people that were going to do stuff at work. And we had arranged with my assistant. She knew, do not call unless it is an absolute emergency. And we got an hour outside of town. My assistant's name came up on my phone, and I thought, there is no way. And I said hello, and she started describing the problem, and Lauren and I looked at each other, and we knew our trip had just been canceled. And I can remember doing a U-turn on the interstate and coming back to Jacksonville. We never even got to the hotel. We never even got to dinner, nothing. It was just, I can remember Lauren and I just looked at each other. We knew the trip was done. This was too urgent. And we came back. There was another time when Lauren and I went to dinner. We'd been waiting for a long time to go out for dinner, and this was going to be a time when we were just going to kick back and relax. And at dinner, we had just ordered food, and my phone started blowing up. Text messages, phone calls. She said, honey, you're going to have to take that. And I picked up the phone. It was a highly involved situation, all sorts of problems. I got up, I walked outside the restaurant, and I paced up and down the sidewalk outside the restaurant. I talked on the phone for I don't know how long. When I finally came back in, Lauren had finished her food. My food was sitting there cold, and dinner was over. It seemed like it kept happening and happening and happening, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. I learned that sometimes, now listen, ministry is demanding, and sometimes our personal plans need to be interrupted for ministry. Sometimes our plans must be interrupted for ministry. But I learned no matter how urgent the times are, no matter how serious the problems are, we as leaders absolutely must avoid a pattern of constant work, even in a time of crisis, because you just get to the law of diminishing returns. Just exhaustion leads to more exhaustion, leads to conflict and difficulty at home, which doesn't help anybody. And one of the most important lessons that I learned about taking breaks was to embrace accountability. I have a group of people in our congregation. A few of them are on staff. Several of them are lay leaders. And this is my accountability team. They are freed up to ask me anything they want. They're freed up to investigate anything they want. At least once a year, I invite these lay leaders into the staff team that I lead, and I leave the room, and the people who report to me can say anything to these lay leaders that they want, and those lay leaders can address anything with me they want. Those folks have access to my wife. My wife has access to them. And one of the things that they are very, very careful to police at all of our meetings is, are you taking breaks? I've had some of those guys call on Friday, which is my day off, and say, I just want to be sure you're not working today. You're not allowed to be working. You're allowed to rest. You're allowed to hang out with Lauren. You're allowed to hang out with the kids. You're not allowed to do anything for First Baptist Church. And I love that accountability. I have embraced that accountability as God's gift to me, and it has helped. I comforted myself with food. So listen, when everything hurt, when everything was stressful, I learned that food was relaxing and food felt good. Food is easy. It doesn't fight back. It tastes good. It makes you feel awesome. It made me feel awesome. But I developed bad habits and I gained weight that's been actually just this problem, because over these last few years of surgery and recovery and all of this nerve medicine, it's actually been challenging to lose some of the weight that I gained. The issue isn't so much about weight gain, though. The issue is more about the disposition of my heart. And I needed to learn not to treat stress with the comforts of food. It's not wrong to indulge in dessert. It's not wrong to enjoy a meal that isn't the most healthy. But I was like, I'd have a piece of cake and then just go get another one just because it felt good. And I needed to learn to be more disciplined and more self-controlled, even in stressful times. Here's the last mistake that I made that I'll talk about. There's a lot of mistakes I made that I could talk about, as I said at the very beginning. Here's the last one that I will share, and it might be the most important one in terms of my actual ministry. That mistake is that I didn't lean into my weaknesses. I need to do a couple things to explain what I mean by this. First, there were 3 times over the last several years when I considered quitting my ministry at First Baptist. The first happened in 2017 when Bob Russell, you've heard from him on this podcast, he flew to Jacksonville to meet with me and Dr. Brunson to talk about our transition and try to improve our transition. And in one of those meetings with Bob Russell is when Dr. Brunson shared with me and Bob that he had the intention to resign and go to another church. Dr. Brunson did not tell me and Bob when he would be leaving or where he would be going, just that it would be happening sometime over the next year. When he shared that, it made me want to quit. I had moved to Jacksonville to be a part of a team. I had moved to Jacksonville to be the junior partner in an effort at leading a larger church. And I don't begrudge anybody, certainly not Dr. Brunson, for feeling the Lord's call to go to a different spot. But for me, I didn't come here to be by myself. And after I learned about all the problems that we were facing, I certainly didn't come to tackle all those challenges by myself. I felt inadequate, I felt unprepared, and I didn't think it would be best for me to stay. One of the most important conversations I've ever had in my life happened when Bob Russell heard my concern about leaving, and he said, "You just can't." He said, "Dr. Brunson's going to leave. If you leave any time in the foreseeable future, you are going to do irreversible damage to the church, and you have to see this through." And so even though I was scared, I quickly put that idea out of my mind. Another time when I thought about leaving was partway through the transition when I got offered a couple of different jobs, and Lauren and I considered that, but very, very quickly decided that we loved our church, and if we were ever going to leave, now was definitely not that time. But there was a third time that I considered leaving, and I've never spoken about this publicly, but it was the time when I most seriously considered leaving. And it was almost a year that I thought about this and prayed about this in late 2020 up to the latter part of 2021. And I want to explain that season and that process of thought so you'll understand what I mean by the serious mistake that I made. I am not a good enough leader, and I am not a good enough preacher to be worthy of the senior pastor role at First Baptist Church. If you had come to me before I came to Jacksonville and you had said, "Hey, First Baptist Church needs a leader to help them transition out of a real desperate situation and into a new season of life and faithfulness, and they need a preacher to shepherd them through that," who would you pick? Well, I would have a list of names for you. I would never put myself on that list, and there aren't too many other people who would put me on such a list either. So if you're looking for the kind of once-in-a-generation leader, once-in-a-generation preacher that a church with the problems like First Baptist has, then I'm not that guy. I know who those guys are, and I know I am not that guy. Even though I know I'm not adequate and sufficient for the post here, I also knew, as I've said before, that I couldn't leave during a time of trial. I couldn't leave when nasty people were doing horrible things. And so train the church that if you don't like what's happening, if you don't like what's going on with the leadership, then just sin and lie and drop bombs. And that's the way you can control the church. I knew I couldn't send that message. But once we got on the other side of the transition, once most of the nastiness had stopped, I want to explain to you the burden that I felt. I'm not anybody's choice for world's best leader, but I have enough knowledge about leadership to know that I'm not the best leader, to know who some of these great leaders are, and to feel a responsibility that if I know better leaders than myself, then don't I have a responsibility to get out of the way and make room for those other better leaders and preachers? And so I, at the time, loved and still today love from the bottom of my heart First Baptist Church and all of our wonderful people. And my concern was not, I don't want to be here. It was the opposite. I love it here. I love these people. I want to serve them. My concern was they need to depend on me to get the best leader and the best preacher that they can get, and I'm not him, and I need to serve our church by getting out of the way and making room for that person. But there was a problem. I couldn't figure out how to persuade everybody that that was true without freaking everybody out. I couldn't figure out how to persuade the leadership team that I'd assembled that I needed to get out of the way and make room for a better leader. I couldn't figure out how to stand up in front of the church and say, I'm going to go and get out of the way to make room for a better guy, without those guys thinking I didn't love them, without them thinking I didn't care for them, without those guys thinking I was stabbing them in the back. I couldn't figure out a way to talk about this without freaking out my family, without alarming the church. I couldn't figure out how to do it in such a way that would ensure that the candidates that I thought should be in the job would then ultimately take the job. I just couldn't figure out how to make any of it work. And so I spent a year really praying and agonizing alone. I didn't have anybody in the church that I could talk to and pray with about it because I didn't want to freak them out. I didn't want to freak out my family, so I didn't talk to them and pray about this with them. And so for the better part of a year, for months and months and months, I agonized over this. And I just kept asking the Lord, I am not this guy, and you know it. You know that there are better men than me to do this work. And I am asking you to raise one of those better men up. I'm asking you to help First Baptist see that I'm not the guy. I'm asking you, there's all these impossible things, and I'm just asking you to figure them all out, because I am not a good enough leader even to figure out how to solve the problem of my leadership that's not good enough. And so I prayed and I prayed and I prayed, and then one morning I was laying on the floor praying. I had my face down in the Bible. I was begging God to solve this problem, to deal with this issue. And as I was praying the words of Scripture, I got to 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 26 to 29, and here's what they say. Consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful, not many were of noble birth, but God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. And I can't even tell you what happened in my heart when I read those words. It was as though a shaft of light from heaven shone out of the sky and lit up those words. And I knew that that was God's word and God's direction and God's wisdom for me. And it was a word of correction for me. It was a word correcting these months worth of mistakes that I had been making, these months worth of wrong thinking. And it just felt so freeing to go, okay, God, I don't have to be wise. I don't have to be powerful. I don't have to be noble. What you do is you raise up the foolish. You raise up the weak. You raise up the things that are not. And it was so freeing to go, okay, Lord, hey, if you want me to be foolish and weak and of no account, well, I can do that. I can be a leader. I can be a man that is foolish and weak and of no account, and you get the glory. It was so freeing. I knew immediately that for a year, I'd been praying the wrong thing. I'd been asking God to raise up the right leader and change the minds of the church and change the minds of the people, and I needed the Lord to change my mind. I needed the Lord to change my heart. That my ministry ambition for years now has only been to be a faithful pastor at First Baptist Church. And I was thinking I needed to find a way to be wise and strong and noble. And if I wasn't, to find somebody who was wise and strong and noble. And it was so freeing to come to understand in prayer before the Lord that my path to being a faithful pastor at First Baptist Church was to be weak, was to be foolish, was to be of no account. And listen, I'm telling you, I've been in ministry for my adult life. I have spent 10 of those years training other ministers at the college and the seminary level, and I made it into my 40s before I really knew in the bottom of my heart that it was not my strengths and my wisdom that commend me to the Lord, but my weaknesses and my foolishness, so that He gets the praise and He gets the glory. It was a year-long mistake to be trying to find a justification in my ongoing ministry, in my strength and in my wisdom. And I am as sorry for that mistaken thinking as I am grateful for the Lord's correction in His Word. It is that weakness, it is that foolishness, it is that lack of account that I need to lean into in order to have justification for my ministry. It is that weakness, it is that foolishness, it is that lack of account that you need to lean into to have strength in your ministry. If you're a member of a ministry and you're looking up front and you're seeing a leader in your ministry who has weaknesses, who has foolishnesses, who has things that make them of no account, then rejoice, because you're seeing things that the Lord is going to use to get glory in a hard situation. It is encouraging to me to know that in the midst of all of these mistakes that I've told you about, as well as the many more mistakes that I haven't told you about, the Lord still did wonderful, great, amazing, and miraculous things in the hard years at First Baptist Church. And it is my weaknesses and my foolishness that gives me great confidence that He is going to continue to do great things in the years ahead at First Baptist. Incompetent ministers, God isn't looking for the strong. He is looking for the weak so that He gets glory even in our mistakes.